I absolutely love American elections. I remember I first went to America in an academic capacity in the fall of 2012 when I started college. And we had this one class called The Road to the White House, which essentially explored how the American political system works, how the different states within America vote, how the Electoral College uh, works, and how each of the individual swing states have an outsized impact on US elections. So I've been following it very closely ever since. It's been about 12 years. This will be the fourth presidential election that I've been following and watching from an analytical standpoint, one would say. And this one is particularly unique because you have an incumbent who is eligible to run for a second term. So in America, you have 2-term limits. And so if you can be an incumbent but not eligible to run. So you have an incumbent who is eligible to run for a second term and initially did seek the nomination, but chose to drop out. Consequence of a bad debate performance, consequence of questions around his health. But that in itself was somewhat unprecedented because it hasn't happened since Lyndon Johnson, as a incumbent president, chose not to run again. The outcomes in that moment, which was in the 60s, was pretty disastrous for the Democrats, where once Lyndon Johnson chose not to run again, the party really struggled to put forth a competent candidate in the election, and consequently Nixon came and won the election in a pretty comprehensive manner. This was in 1968. In this scenario, we find a pretty unique situation twist, wherein the incumbent president, at the point at which he made the decision to not fight another election, it actually gave the Democrats a huge fillip. It gave them a huge impetus to go out and fight the 2024 November elections. There was almost a sense of malaise, there was almost a sense of indignation, defeat, stemming from the poor candidacy that the incumbent president was putting forth against Trump. And so with Kamala Harris coming into the fray and the party pretty quickly coalescing around her, it's made the 2024 outcome far more of a contest than it previously was. The assassination attempt on Donald Trump, which should absolutely never happen in any sophisticated major democracy and society, was condemnable, but it also swung a lot of the opinion towards the Republicans. There was a sense of sympathy, and you saw that play out during the Republican National Committee convention, where it became pretty clear that the Republicans had a greater than 80% chance of reclaiming the White House. So from that environment to even bringing it back down to a 50-50, in my mind, suggests that the Democrats have done extraordinarily well in recapturing some of the narrative. Today, if I had to think about what the outcome would mean from an India perspective, I think some degree of continuity would be good for India. Having a woman of Indian origin in the White House can only be helpful. We've seen how that's played out in another major democracy in the United Kingdom, where we've seen Rishi Sunak celebrate Diwali on 10 Downing Street and take his oath on the Bhagavad Gita. Now, you won't see that kind of Indianness from Kamala Harris, but I'm pretty confident that a rapport can be established as a consequence of her being in the White House and us looking to America and looking west from a whole variety of strategic perspectives, from defense to diplomacy. In terms of what a Trump presidency could mean for India. He's been tough on China. He's been tough on Pakistan, both obvious adversaries of India from a military standpoint. So that will naturally be a huge positive. On trade, he has adopted a very clear America First policy, which has included hiking tariffs on a variety of goods and services, some of which would adversely impact India's export capability. So he's been fairly hawkish on trade, which can be a net negative for India. And then there is an element of chaos that comes with the Trump presidency, which can be difficult for any country that is a friend of America to manage through. What do I mean by this chaos? There's a lot of churn in his administrations. There are a lot of loose statements made without much thought of consequence from a geopolitical standpoint. All of those things create instability and uncertainty, which would naturally have an adverse impact on India. India craves today geopolitical certainty and stability because we're the bright spot in the economy. We are in the global economy. We are the country that is expected to drive a lot of global growth going forward. So any challenges to that thesis and that narrative is something that India would hopefully reject and hope to not see. So in that sense, a Kamala Harris presidency may seem like the better option given the sense of calm and certainty that you would get in an administration like that. We've seen it play out even in Biden's presidency over the last 4 years. That said, America is such an important force to reckon with that India will do business with either side. And it's imperative for both the US and India to have a strong relationship in a world in which China is hoping to play a bigger geopolitical game.
How do you see the growth of the equity markets of these two nations?
In terms of American equity markets, it's interesting that in FY24, which is we've now had about 8 months or 9 months now of this calendar year, you've seen that about 7 or 8 names that are linked to the artificial intelligence story just completely outperform and dominate equity returns, whereas the remaining 493 odd names relatively staying stagnant in terms of what they're offering equity market participants. That level of concentration poses a significant risk to their equity markets, particularly if the AI story, from a commercial standpoint, doesn't play out as quickly as is being underwritten in investor models and analyst assumptions and the like. So I think it's important to kind of be wary of a market where you have this imbalance of winners and losers, versus if you look at India's equity markets, for example, it's far more broad-based. Most businesses that have been delivering strong earnings growth have performed really well in India, versus in the United States, much of the US equity market return has been concentrated in about 7 names. An interesting way to look at this is those 7 names today are a bigger and bigger constituent of the S&P 500 as a percent of the S&P 500's market cap weightage. And so the S&P 500 has done decently well in 2024. But if you looked at an equal weighted market cap index for the S&P 500, it's actually been close to flat. And so if you take those 7 names out of the index, the S&P 500 hasn't done as well. Versus in India, you could take 7, 10, 15 names out of the index. You'll still see pretty broad-based returns.
and to compare startup culture in both these nations?
Look, America is 100 years ahead of India. There's no two ways about it. I think of India today as America in the early 1900s, where you had about 10 or 15 families that dominate the business ecosystem. Those 10 or 15 families are critical to the capital expenditure story, they're critical to the earnings story of the country. We're slowly seeing that change in India, where the next, call it 200-300 businesses are now starting to participate in a pretty meaningful way, both from an earnings perspective and are now seeing their market capitalizations grow pretty meaningfully. But it is, America is so far ahead that their startup ecosystem is also far greater and bigger than it is here in India. And those are a function of two or three things, right? So one, America has been able to put together 50 to 100 world-class universities that have this feeling and this emphasis on research and development, on R&D, and that has spurred a lot of innovation in the American startup ecosystem. So you have the universities. American capital markets are also much deeper than they are here in India. And so the levels of funding that you could get in the United States are 10x or 100x more than what you could get in India. So, when you add all of that up together, they have a much bigger ecosystem. The number of unicorns, the number of startups that have done well in America are multifold that of India. That said, we are playing catch up and extremely quickly. We are not going to take 100 years to get to America's level. We're already seeing the vast majority of large venture capital firms set up shop in India, bring big amounts of capital to India to deploy here. Our universities, interestingly, beyond the IITs and IIMs, which is where you typically assume a lot of the startup founders come from, you're now starting to see a majority of venture capital dollars flow to non-IIT, non-IIM, non-foreign educated entrepreneurs, which is extremely exciting in my mind, because when you have that cohort of people start to take an interest in building their own businesses and doing something innovative, that's when the ecosystem gets more and more vibrant. Just a trip across Bangalore will tell you that, yes, today we may be behind San Francisco, but that day is not very far where we'll be on par or even excel some of the work that's happening in the West.